The offer arrived in a manila envelope, hand-delivered by a man in a company truck who had driven 2 hours from the regional office to make sure it landed in the right hands personally. That detail alone told Robert Haynes something about how badly they wanted his signature on it. Men in company trucks don't drive 2 hours to deliver paperwork that isn't worth the fuel. He set the envelope on the kitchen table without opening it. Made coffee. Stood at the window and looked at the yard the way he did every morning. Not dramatically, not with any particular sentiment, just the habitual orientation of a man who checks the same view every day, the same way he checks the weather and the grain prices and the fluid levels on his equipment. It was information. The yard was always information, if you knew how to read it. Then he sat down and opened the envelope. The offer was from Consolidated Grain Partners, a regional agricultural consolidation company that had been quietly acquiring or partnering with mid-sized grain operations across 4 counties for the better part of 3 years. Their model was not hostile. They did not force sales, did not foreclose on distressed operations, did not arrive with lawyers and ultimatums. Their model was patient and structured, and on paper, genuinely attractive to the kind of farmer who was tired of carrying operational risk alone and had started to wonder whether the next generation would want to carry it at all. Robert was 57 years old and had one son who worked in technology in a city 400 miles away and called on Sundays and meant it well, but would never farm this ground. Robert knew this. He had known it for years. He kept it in the category of facts that were simply true and did not require ongoing grief. The offer was $340,000 for a controlling interest in the operation, structured as a partnership rather than an outright sale. Robert would retain minority ownership. He would continue operating the land for a guaranteed 10-year period at a documented salary. His debt, a number that had been managed but never fully resolved across 15 years of agricultural economics that had not always been cooperative, would be absorbed into the consolidated structure and effectively zeroed out from Robert's personal liability. $340,000. Debt cleared. 10 years of guaranteed income on land he already knew how to farm. He read it twice. Then he set it down and drank his coffee and looked at the yard again. The catch was on page 7. It was not written as a catch. It was written as a standard operational alignment requirement, the kind of language that corporate documents use when they want something that would generate resistance if stated plainly. The language said that all equipment within the consolidated operation would be standardized to approved manufacturer relationships within 18 months of partnership commencement. Approved manufacturer relationships. Robert read that phrase 3 times. He called the regional representative, a man named Douglas Pratt, who had been his primary contact through the preliminary discussions, and asked directly what that phrase meant in practice. Douglas said it meant the operation would transition to John Deere equipment across all major categories, consistent with the consolidated structure's fleet standardization policy. He said this was not a reflection on Robert's current equipment. He said it was purely a maintenance and service infrastructure decision, that running a standardized fleet across multiple operations in a region reduced the consolidated structure's service complexity and parts inventory requirements significantly. Robert asked about his Massey Ferguson combine specifically. Douglas said the combine would be included in the transition. Said the consolidated structure had a relationship with a regional John Deere dealer that provided preferred service response times and parts pricing that more than offset the capital cost of the equipment change. Said the transition was designed to be seamless. Said a lot of things, fluently and professionally, that added up to the Massey Ferguson goes. Robert thanked him and said he'd have a decision within 2 weeks. He hung up and sat at the desk for a long time without moving. What happened over the next 14 days was not visible to anyone outside the farmhouse. Robert did not discuss it at the elevator. He did not discuss it at the co-op. He did not call his son in the city, though he thought about it twice and decided both times that the conversation would produce more noise than clarity. He sat with the numbers. Not the offer numbers. Those were clear and they were genuinely good, and Robert did not make the mistake of pretending otherwise. He sat with his own numbers. The notebooks that lived in the second drawer of the desk in the farm office, 31 years of operational records kept in his father's hand for the first 9 and in Robert's own hand for the 22 after. Cost per acre by year, downtime events by machine by season, parts costs, repair costs. The slow accumulation of operational data that most farmers generated but few kept with the consistency and completeness that the Haynes family had maintained across 3 decades. He was not looking for a reason to say no. He was looking for an accurate picture of what he would actually be trading. On day 3, he pulled the records specifically related to the Massey Ferguson combine. Every season it had run his ground, every cost, every downtime event, every comparison he had made across the years between its performance and the documented performance of comparable machines in his county. He laid it out across the kitchen table in chronological order and sat with it the way a man sits with evidence he needs to evaluate, without the distortion of what he already believes. What the records showed was not surprising to Robert, because he had been building these records for 22 years and understood what they contained. But seeing it laid out completely, in the specific context of a decision with this much weight, clarified something he had known in a general way and now needed to know precisely. The Massey Ferguson combine, over its operational life on his ground, had produced a cost per acre harvested figure that was lower than any comparable machine in his documented comparison data. Not dramatically lower, not in a way that made headlines or settled arguments at the elevator, but consistently lower, year over year, in a way that compounded across seasons into a number that was real and significant and directly responsible for the margin that had kept the operation viable through the years, when the margin had been the difference between continuing and not continuing. The reason was not the machine in isolation. The reason was the relationship between the machine and the man operating it. 30 years of accumulated knowledge of how that specific equipment behaved on that specific ground under that specific range of conditions. The reason was 0 unplanned downtime during critical harvest windows across the last 8 years. The reason was a parts inventory in the shed that reflected 3 decades of understanding exactly which components were most likely to need attention and when. The reason was a mechanic named Bill Costas, who had worked on that machine for 19 years, and who answered his phone at any hour, and who understood the machine at a level that a dealer's certified technician, working on a standardized fleet of machines he'd serviced for 18 months, simply could not match. Robert could not transfer any of that to a John Deere. He could buy the machine, he could hire the dealer, he could build new records from 0 in a new relationship with new equipment. But he could not buy the 30 years. On day 8, he called Douglas Pratt back, not to give his answer, to ask a question. He asked whether the equipment standardization requirement was negotiable, whether there was a provision for existing equipment that demonstrated documented operational performance above the consolidated structure's benchmarks, whether the policy had ever been modified for a specific operation with a specific justification. Douglas said he appreciated the question. He said the policy existed precisely to remove case-by-case exceptions, because exceptions created the service complexity the policy was designed to eliminate. He said he understood that Robert had a long history with his current equipment, and that transitions were always an adjustment. He said the dealer relationship they had established was genuinely excellent, and that most operators who had made the transition reported satisfaction within 1 season. He said the requirement was not negotiable. Robert thanked him again and said he'd have his answer by end of week. He hung up and looked at the kitchen table where the records were still spread out. He looked at one specific number, the downtime hours for the previous 8 harvest seasons. Combined, all seasons, every machine on the operation, the number was 11 hours. 11 hours of unplanned downtime across 8 harvest seasons. He had not advertised this number. It was simply what the records showed, and the records showed it because he had built the records the way his father had built them. Completely, without omission, because incomplete records were worse than no records at all. He thought about what 11 hours across 8 seasons meant in the context of a consolidated operation running standardized equipment across multiple farms with centralized service response. He thought about Dale Whitmore, 2 sections over, who ran the newest generation of precision equipment and had spent 19 hours waiting for a technician during the previous harvest's critical window. 19 hours. On a machine that was 18 months old, under warranty, with a dealer who had, by every account, responded as quickly as the regional service infrastructure allowed. The infrastructure was the constraint, not the dealer's intention, not the machine's design. The infrastructure, the finite number of qualified technicians who could work on systems of that complexity, distributed across a geography that had more critical harvest windows occurring simultaneously than the service network was built to absorb. Robert's 11 hours had not come from luck. They had come from 30 years of building a support structure that did not depend on that network. He could not take that structure into a consolidated fleet arrangement. The consolidated fleet arrangement by design was the network. He called Douglas Pratt on day 12. He said he had reviewed the offer completely and appreciated the structure and understood the value the consolidation presented. He said the debt relief alone was a number he had not taken lightly. He said the guaranteed 10-year income on land he knew how to farm was a genuinely attractive proposition. Then, he said no. Douglas, to his credit, did not immediately pivot to persuasion. He asked Robert if he was willing to share his reasoning. Robert said the equipment requirement was the issue, not as a matter of preference or brand loyalty, as a matter of operational risk that he could not quantify in a way that made the transition acceptable within his own financial model. Douglas said he understood that perspective, though he respectfully disagreed with Robert's assessment of the consolidated structure's service capabilities. Robert said he respected that disagreement. He said he'd reached his decision the same way he reached every decision, from the records. And the records told him that what he would be giving up in the equipment transition was not replaceable within a time frame that the offer's economics could compensate for. Douglas said the offer would remain open for 30 days if Robert wanted to reconsider. Robert said he appreciated that. He did not reconsider. The county heard about it within a week. Not from Robert. From Douglas Pratt's side of the equation, through the regional network of agricultural business relationships, that meant nothing stayed quiet for long in a county this size. By the time the story had traveled through the elevator and the co-op and the equipment dealer's service waiting room, it had acquired the specific shape of a community narrative about a man making an irrational decision. $340,000. Debt cleared. 10 years guaranteed. And he said no because of an old Massey Ferguson combine. That was the version that traveled. Gene Harwick, who farmed 2 sections to Robert's west and had sold his own operation to a consolidation company 18 months earlier, at terms he described as the best decision he'd made in 20 years of farming, said it plainly at the elevator one Thursday morning. Said Robert Haynes had always been stubborn, but this was something else. Said the numbers didn't lie and Robert was lying to himself if he thought a 30-year-old machine loyalty was worth $340,000 and a clean debt sheet. Several people nodded. Nobody asked what Robert's own numbers said. Robert heard about Gene's elevator comment indirectly. He did not respond to it. He went home and serviced the Massey Ferguson for the preseason check, the same way he had every spring for 22 years. And he logged the service in the notebook, and he filed the notebook in the drawer, and he went to bed at a reasonable hour. Consolidated Grain Partners expanded aggressively over the following 2 years. They were good at what they did. The consolidation model worked for the right operations, under the right conditions, managed by people who understood regional agriculture at the level the company's leadership genuinely did. Several operations in the county that joined the consolidated structure reported improved margins, reduced individual risk exposure, and the specific relief that comes from transferring the weight of independent operation to a structure with more resources. None of this was lost on Robert. He tracked it the same way he tracked everything, not obsessively, not with the investment of a man who needed events to vindicate a decision already made, but with the genuine attention of someone who understood that the regional agricultural landscape was information, and information was always worth having. What he also tracked, because the records were available to anyone who paid attention, was the consolidated structure's equipment service events during the 2 harvest seasons following his decision. Not in detail, he didn't have access to their internal records, but at the level of elevator conversations and co-op talk and the specific silences that fell when certain topics came up, which in a county this size was often enough to reconstruct the shape of what had happened. In the first harvest season following the expansion, the consolidated structure had experienced 3 significant equipment downtime events across its regional portfolio during critical harvest windows. The centralized service model, which had been designed for normal distribution of demand, had been strained by simultaneous failures in the compressed window that the regional weather that year had produced. Response times had been longer than the structure's marketing materials had specified as typical. 2 of the affected operations had experienced yield quality impacts from delayed harvest in conditions that did not wait for technician availability. Robert did not say anything about this at the elevator. He did not say anything at the co-op. He did not call Douglas Pratt. He wrote the number in the notebook. The 3rd year was when the consolidated structure's expansion hit a problem that the 2 cooperative years had not revealed. A financing reconfiguration at the parent company level, the kind of decision that gets made in offices that have no windows facing grain fields, triggered a review of the regional portfolio that resulted in the renegotiation of partnership terms with several of the operations the structure had absorbed. The renegotiation was not hostile, but its terms were less favorable than the original agreements, and the operations that had entered the consolidation with their debt absorbed and their individual risk transferred found themselves in a position that was, in certain specific ways, less independent than the original offer materials had implied. Gene Harwick's operation was among those affected. Gene did not talk about it publicly in any detail. What reached Robert through the county's information network was limited and incomplete, as such things always are. But the specific quality of Gene's silence on the topic, in a man who had never been quiet about anything for long, told Robert enough. Robert called Gene in October. Not to say anything about the decision Robert had made 3 years earlier. Not to revisit the elevator comment or extract any form of acknowledgement from a situation that was difficult enough without that. He called because Gene Harwick had been his neighbor for 24 years, and whatever had happened with the consolidated structure's renegotiation, Gene was still a farmer dealing with a hard development on his own operation, and that was reason enough to call. They talked for 40 minutes. Robert mostly listened. Gene said things that a man says when he's processing a disappointment that he had not fully prepared for because the original terms had seemed too solid to question closely. Near the end of the call, Gene said, without quite saying it directly, he understood now why Robert had said no. Robert said the offer had been a good one, said he believed that honestly. Said the reasons he had said no were specific to his own situation and his own numbers, and he didn't think they applied universally. Gene said that was a generous way to put it. Robert said it was the accurate way to put it. They hung up. Douglas Pratt called the following spring. Not about the original offer. That window had long since closed. He called because the consolidated structure was genuinely interested in understanding the operational model of farms that had declined participation as part of a review the company was conducting of its own service and support infrastructure. He said this with the specific candor of a man who had spent 3 years watching a prediction he had respectfully made not come true, and who was professional enough to want to understand why. Robert agreed to the conversation. He explained for the first time to someone outside his own kitchen the full version of what the records showed and what the decision had actually been based on. Not the emotional version, the numerical version, the cost per acre data, the downtime record, the support structure he had built across 30 years around a specific machine on specific ground, the calculation he had run about what it would cost in real operational terms to rebuild that structure from zero with new equipment inside a centralized service model. Douglas listened without interrupting. When Robert finished, Douglas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's not a calculation I had access to." Robert said he knew. Said no outside party would have had access to it, because it lived in notebooks in a drawer and had never been presented to anyone as an argument, because no one had ever asked him to present it. Douglas said, "If you'd shown me those records in the original conversation, I don't know that I'd have pushed the equipment requirement the way I did." Robert said he appreciated that. He said the records were built to inform his own decisions, not to win arguments. Said the decision had been right for his operation, and he wasn't sure it would have been right for any other operation in the county. Because the records were specific to his ground and his machine and his 30 years of paying attention to both. Douglas said he was going to use this conversation internally. Robert said that seemed like a reasonable thing to do. The Massey Ferguson ran that fall the same way it had run every fall for 22 years. Robert finished harvest within his target window. The service record went in the notebook. The notebook went in the drawer. The drawer closed. Outside, the county moved through its own accounting of the season, yields and prices, and the particular arithmetic of agricultural economics that never fully resolved in anyone's favor, but that men and women kept showing up to work with every spring, regardless, because the land required it, and because some obligations don't dissolve just because the numbers are hard. Robert Haynes had walked away from $340,000 and a clean debt sheet because of what 30 years of notebooks said about a Massey Ferguson combine and the man who operated it. The county had called it madness. The records called it something else. The records called it the only decision the numbers actually supported. They had been saying so for 30 years. Nobody had thought to ask them.